The war against the swarm had lasted 3 brutal years. Emperor Draken had seen entire star systems burn, watched good soldiers fall, and made decisions that would haunt him for centuries. His golden scales, once brilliant enough to blind, were now dulled by scars and ash. His wings had holes torn through them from plasma fire. But the war was over, and he was finally going home. The palace looked exactly as he'd left it. White marble columns reached toward the sky, crystalline domes reflected the twin suns, and servants moved through the halls with practiced efficiency. They bowed as he passed, their eyes filled with reverence and fear. Draken barely noticed them. His mind was elsewhere, fixed on 3 small faces he hadn't seen in what felt like a lifetime. His advisors tried to intercept him at every turn. Chancellor Morris wanted to discuss trade agreements. General Blake needed signatures on military reorganization documents. Lady Catherine insisted they schedule a public address within the week. Draken waved them all away with a flick of his massive tail. Politics could wait. Paperwork could wait. Everything could wait. All he wanted was to see his children. The imperial nursery was on the eastern wing of the palace, 3 floors up. Draken climbed the grand staircase, his claws clicking against polished stone. He remembered carrying his mate up these same stairs when she was pregnant with their first child. He remembered her laughter echoing through these halls. Now there was only silence and the whisper of his own breathing. As he approached the nursery doors, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A voice. A human voice. Soft and melodic, singing words he didn't recognize. The language was old Earth, he thought, from before humanity had reached the stars. The melody was simple but beautiful, the kind of song that spoke of safety and home. Draken's first instinct was anger. Who had allowed a human into his children's private chambers? Where were the royal guards? Where were the dragon nursemaids he'd specifically approved before leaving for war? But something about that voice made him hesitate. There was warmth in it. Genuine affection. The kind of tone you couldn't fake, not even if you tried. He pushed open the heavy doors as quietly as a 15-foot-tall dragon possibly could. The nursery was exactly as he remembered it. Toys scattered across the floor, books stacked in corners, tapestries showing dragon legends covering the walls. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. And there, in the corner by the fireplace, sat the most peculiar sight Draken had seen in his entire life. A human woman occupied the massive cushioned chair that had been custom-made for dragon nursemaids. She looked absurdly small in it, like a child sitting in her parents' throne. But despite her size, she somehow held all 3 of his children. His eldest son, 7-year-old Ryan, had his horned head resting against her shoulder. His scales were forest green, just like his mother's had been. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and even. One of his small wings draped across the woman's back like a blanket. 5-year-old Lily was curled up in the woman's lap, her silver scales catching the light. She was sucking her thumb, something Draken had been told she'd started doing after news of her mother's death reached the palace. Her tail was wrapped loosely around the woman's waist. And then there was Thomas. His youngest. Barely 4 years old. The child who'd never met his mother because she died bringing him into this world. Thomas had his tiny body pressed against the woman's side, his small tail wrapped around her forearm so tightly it must have cut off circulation. His scales were pure gold, identical to Draken's own. The human woman seemed to sense his presence. Her eyes opened, and she looked directly at him. They were brown, warm and kind. She didn't startle or jump, didn't wake the children. She simply smiled, pressed a finger to her lips in a universal gesture for quiet, and then went back to humming that strange, beautiful song. Draken stood frozen in the doorway. He was the Dragon Emperor. He commanded fleets that could crack planets. He'd personally led the charge that broke the swarm's main hive. He'd negotiated peace treaties with species that had been enemies for millennia. But right now, watching this tiny human woman cradle his 3 children, he had absolutely no idea what to do. His children looked peaceful. More than peaceful. They looked happy. Safe. Loved. When was the last time he'd seen them look like that? Had they ever looked like that, even before he left? The Emperor of the Draconess Empire, conqueror of the swarm, stood in that doorway and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 3 long years. He felt hope. The first person Draken questioned was Helen, the head housekeeper. She was an older dragon with copper scales and kind eyes who'd served the imperial family for nearly a century. She found him in his private study the morning after his return, going through reports he'd ignored the day before. "Your Majesty," Helen began carefully, "I imagine you have questions about Miss Rebecca." "That's her name? The human?" Draken set down the report he wasn't really reading anyway. Helen nodded. Rebecca Walsh. Her Majesty, the Empress, hired her about 6 months before you left for war. She came highly recommended from the human settlement on the northern continent. She was supposed to help with the children's language studies, teach them about human culture and customs. Draken leaned back in his chair. And after the Empress died, the council wanted to dismiss her immediately. They said the children needed proper dragon caregivers, not some human teacher. Helen's expression grew distant. But Rebecca refused to leave. She'd made a promise to the Empress, she said. A deathbed promise. The council tried to force the issue, but the children wouldn't let her go. Young Ryan threw an absolute fit. Started breathing fire at anyone who came near her. So they let her stay temporarily, until you return to make a final decision. 3 years is a long time for temporary. Yes, Your Majesty. It is. Over the following days, Draken found himself watching Rebecca whenever he could do so without being obvious. He told himself it was due diligence, making sure this human was actually qualified to care for his children. But truthfully, he was fascinated. She had a routine with them that seemed chaotic but somehow worked perfectly. Breakfast was always an adventure. She turned the dining table into a pirate ship one morning, and the children had to earn their food by solving riddles. Ryan loved it. Even little Thomas, who apparently hadn't spoken a word since learning about his mother's death, had smiled and nodded along. During afternoon lessons, Rebecca didn't force them to sit still like traditional dragon tutors demanded. Instead, she let them move around, act things out, turn history into plays and mathematics into games. When Lily struggled with a concept, Rebecca never showed frustration. She just found a different way to explain it, and then another, until something clicked. But it was the small moments that really caught Draken's attention. The way Rebecca automatically moved a cup away from the edge of the table before Ryan's tail could knock it over. How she kept burn ointment in her pocket because Lily was still learning to control her fire breath and sometimes singed things by accident. The way she'd learned to read Thomas's moods without him saying a single word. One afternoon, Draken was walking past the garden when he heard shouting. He rushed toward the sound and found Ryan crying, his scales darkening with distress. Smoke was coming from his nostrils, a sign he was about to lose control and start breathing fire everywhere. Rebecca was already there, kneeling in front of him despite the very real danger. Dragon fire could melt steel, and Ryan was old enough to do serious damage. Hey, it's okay, she said softly. Tell me what happened. I miss Mom. Ryan shouted, and a small burst of flame shot past Rebecca's shoulder, scorching the rose bush behind her. She didn't even flinch. I know you do. I know. Rebecca opened her arms, and Ryan crashed into her, sobbing against her shoulder. His claws could have torn through her like paper, but he was careful even in his grief. Your mom loved you so much. She'd be so proud of the dragon you're becoming. But I don't remember what she smelled like anymore, Ryan choked out. I'm forgetting her. Rebecca held him tighter. Then we'll talk about her. Every day if you want. I'll tell you every story I remember. We'll make sure you never really forget. Draken watched from behind a column as this small human woman comforted his son in a way he didn't know how to. He'd been trained in warfare, politics, and leadership. Nobody had taught him how to handle a grieving child. The dragon nobles who came to visit treated Rebecca with polite condescension. Lord Patterson called her the help within her hearing. Lady Morrison once asked if Rebecca needed help understanding complicated dragon matters when discussing the children's education. Ambassador Clark questioned whether a human could truly understand the needs of dragon royalty. Rebecca handled it all with grace that Draken found remarkable. She never argued, never showed anger. She just continued doing her job, loving his children when everyone else seemed more concerned with protocol than people. One evening, Draken finally approached her directly. She was in the library, reading a story to Thomas, who was curled up beside her like a cat. When she saw the Emperor, she started to stand, but Draken waved her back down. Finish your story, he said. So she did, and Draken listened to a tale about brave knights and clever dragons who learned to work together. When Thomas finally fell asleep, Rebecca carefully lifted him and placed him on the couch, covering him with a blanket. Why did you stay? Draken asked quietly. You could have left with full pay and honors. Gone anywhere in the Empire. Why stay here? Rebecca was quiet for a moment, looking at Thomas's sleeping face. 5 years ago, my entire family was killed in a swarm raid. My parents, my brother, my sister, and her children. I was off-world for work, so I survived. But I came home to nothing. She finally looked up at Draken. When the Empress hired me, I was just going through the motions. Existing but not really living. Then I met your children, and they needed someone so badly. Ryan trying to be brave for his siblings. Lily having nightmares every night. Thomas who wouldn't eat or sleep properly. She smiled sadly. They needed someone who wouldn't leave. And I needed to be needed again. We saved each other, Your Majesty. Draken sat down heavily in a chair across from her. This human, who'd lost everything, had given his children what he couldn't. She'd given them stability, security, love. Thank you, he said finally, for staying. Rebecca smiled. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. The summons came on a cold Tuesday morning. The High Council required Emperor Draken's presence to discuss matters of imperial succession and the proper upbringing of the royal heirs. Draken knew exactly what that meant. They were going to demand he remove Rebecca from the palace. The council chamber was an impressive room, all vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the marble floor. 12 of the Empire's most powerful dragons sat in a semicircle, their scales gleaming in shades of bronze, silver, crimson, and black. These were the nobles who'd helped him rule for decades, the generals who'd won wars, the scholars who'd shaped policy. Chancellor Morris opened the proceedings. He was an ancient dragon with silver scales and eyes that had seen 3 emperors come and go. Your Majesty, we gather today to address a matter of some delicacy. The matter of your children's care and education. Draken settled onto his throne and waited. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the best strategy. Lady Victoria spoke next. Her crimson scales caught the light as she moved, and her voice was smooth as silk. We understand that during the war, certain temporary arrangements were necessary. The human servant provided adequate care during your absence. However, now that you've returned, it's time to implement proper protocols. Proper protocols, Draken repeated flatly. Lord Patterson cleared his throat. He was a military dragon, scarred from a dozen campaigns. Your Majesty, we've prepared a list of qualified candidates. Dragon nursemaids from the finest families. Tutors from the Imperial Academy. Scholars who've educated nobility for generations. He pushed a tablet across the floor toward Draken's throne. Draken glanced at it without picking it up. Impressive credentials, all of them. Dragons who'd never burned their sleeve while comforting a frightened child. Dragons who'd never sat up all night with a sick toddler. Dragons who knew everything about education and nothing about love. And what about Rebecca? Draken asked. The council exchanged glances. Ambassador Clark, whose black scales were shot through with gold, spoke carefully. The human has served adequately. She'll receive generous compensation and excellent references. I'm sure she'll find employment elsewhere in the Empire. That's not what I asked. I asked about keeping her as primary guardian for my children. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lord Patterson leaned forward. Your Majesty, with all respect, that would be highly inappropriate. The human is, well, human. She'll be dead in 40 or 50 years. Do you want your children to suffer that loss? They've already lost their mother. Why set them up for more grief? Not to mention, Lady Victoria added delicately, the optics. What will the other empires think? The Draconess Emperor allowing his heirs to be raised by a lesser species? It suggests weakness. Lesser species, Draken repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Lady Victoria realized her mistake but pushed forward anyway. Your Majesty knows what I mean. Humans are fine for certain roles. Excellent administrators, creative artists, decent soldiers. But raising imperial heirs? That requires understanding dragon psychology, dragon history, dragon values. A human simply cannot provide what your children need. General Brooks, who'd fought beside Draken in the war, finally spoke up. He was covered in scars, missing part of his wing, and had earned his position through blood and fire. I fought alongside humans. Good ones. Brave ones. Watched them hold defensive lines when dragons twice their size retreated. Saw them share their last rations with wounded soldiers from other species. He looked around the chamber at the other council members. Maybe the children don't need someone who understands dragon superiority. Maybe they need someone who understands that courage and loyalty aren't about the color of your scales. Lord Patterson snorted. With respect, General, battlefield heroics don't qualify someone to raise the future rulers of our empire. And what does qualify someone? General Brooks challenged. A fancy education? The right bloodline? I've seen those fancy educated dragons run from battle crying for their mothers. Give me one loyal human over 10 prestigious cowards any day. The argument escalated quickly. Voices rose, tails slammed against marble, and at one point Lady Victoria and General Brooks were shouting directly at each other. Draken let it continue for a while, learning who stood where. Finally, he'd heard enough. Enough. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of imperial command. The chamber fell silent instantly. I hear your concerns, Draken said carefully. And I will consider them. However, I will make no hasty decisions about my children's welfare. Chancellor Morris leaned forward. Your Majesty, the Council must vote on this matter. It's protocol for decisions affecting the imperial succession. Then vote, Draken said coldly. They did. 10-2 in favor of removing Rebecca from the palace within 30 days. Only General Brooks and Admiral Hayes, another war veteran, voted against it. Draken could override the vote. As Emperor, he had that power. But doing so would create a rift in his government at a time when they needed unity. The Empire was recovering from war. They had treaties to negotiate, territories to rebuild, veterans to care for. He couldn't afford a political crisis over one human woman. Could he? That night, Draken walked the palace halls, unable to sleep. His mind churned with possibilities and consequences. He could keep Rebecca and risk destabilizing his government. He could dismiss her and break his children's hearts. There had to be a third option, but he couldn't see it. He found himself outside the nursery, drawn there without conscious thought. The door was slightly open, and he could hear voices inside. Why are you sad, Miss Rebecca? That was Lily's voice, high and worried. Oh, sweetie, I'm fine. Just thinking about grown-up things. Are they sending you away? Ryan's voice this time, trying to sound brave and failing. I heard the servants talking. There was a long pause. Draken held his breath. I don't know what's going to happen, Rebecca said finally, and Draken could hear the tears in her voice. But I promise you, no matter what, I love you three more than anything in this world. And that will never change, okay? Even if we're apart, I'll always love you. I don't want you to go. That was Thomas. His youngest son, who hadn't spoken in nearly a year, was finally using his voice. But it was breaking Draken's heart to hear it. Please don't leave us. Everyone leaves us. Oh, Thomas. Rebecca's voice cracked. Come here, all of you. Draken heard movement, the rustle of wings and scales. He peered through the crack in the door and saw his 3 children piled onto Rebecca, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a stormy sea. Please, Daddy, Thomas said, looking directly at the door where Draken stood hidden in shadow. Please don't send her away. She makes the darkness less scary. Draken stepped back from the door, his heart hammering. His youngest son had spoken for the first time in a year, and it was to beg him not to destroy their family again. He walked back to his chambers with heavy steps. The council wanted him to choose between his children's happiness and political stability. Between love and duty. But as he lay awake watching the moons cross the sky, Draken realized something. He'd spent 3 years making impossible choices. He'd sacrificed millions to save billions. He'd burned worlds to protect the Empire. Maybe it was time to make a different kind of choice. Rebecca Walsh submitted her formal request for an audience with the Emperor 3 days after the council's vote. The protocol office tried to discourage her. A human servant requesting private time with the Dragon Emperor was unusual at best, inappropriate at worst. But Rebecca had learned a thing or two about dragon bureaucracy in her years at the palace. She quoted the exact subsection of imperial law that guaranteed any member of the imperial household the right to petition the throne. They couldn't deny her after that. The meeting was scheduled for early morning in the Emperor's private study, not the throne room. Rebecca took that as a good sign. Draken could have forced her to grovel before the full court, made an example of a human stepping above her station. Instead, he was giving her privacy. She dressed carefully that morning. Not her usual work clothes, the simple tunics and pants she wore while chasing after 3 energetic dragon children. Instead, she wore the one formal dress she owned, a deep blue human-style garment that her mother had made for her years ago. It was proper but not presumptuous. Respectful without trying to imitate dragon fashion. She practiced her bow in the mirror. Dragons had specific protocols for this sort of thing. The depth of the bow, the position of the hands, the duration of eye contact, all of it mattered. Too shallow and she'd seem disrespectful. Too deep and she'd seem like she was mocking herself. She'd studied the etiquette books until her eyes crossed. When the time came, a palace guard escorted her through the winding corridors to the emperor's study. Her heart pounded with each step. She was about to argue with the most powerful being in the known galaxy. A creature who could literally turn her to ash with a single breath. But she'd promised the empress she'd protect those children. And Rebecca Walsh kept her promises. Draken was standing by the window when she entered, his massive form silhouetted against the morning light. He turned as she walked in, and Rebecca performed her bow exactly as she'd practiced. Correct depth, correct duration, eyes lowered respectfully. Your Majesty, thank you for granting me this audience. Rise, Rebecca. Please, sit. Draken gestured to a chair that had been brought in, human-sized, positioned across from his own desk. Rebecca sat, keeping her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Professional. Composed. Even though inside she was terrified. I understand you wanted to speak with me, Draken said, settling into his own chair. It was massive, designed to hold a dragon, but he made himself as small as possible, clearly trying not to intimidate her. It was a kindness she appreciated, even if it didn't entirely work. Yes, Your Majesty. I wanted to address the Council's decision. Rebecca pulled out a folder she'd prepared. If I may speak freely? Draken nodded. Please do. Rebecca opened her folder, revealing printed documents, charts, and research papers. She'd spent the last 3 nights preparing this presentation. Your Majesty, I understand the Council's concerns. I'm human. I will die long before your children reach adulthood by dragon standards. This is a valid concern. She pulled out the first document. However, I've researched developmental psychology across multiple species. This is a study from the Galactic University, conducted over 50 years with subjects from 17 different races. The findings are consistent. Young beings, regardless of species, need stable attachment figures, especially after experiencing trauma. Draken leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes focused on the papers. Your children have experienced significant trauma, Rebecca continued, keeping her voice steady and professional. They lost their mother. They lost you to war, not knowing if you'd return. Ryan has anxiety that manifests as fire breathing when stressed. Lily has nightmares 3 times a week. Thomas stopped speaking for nearly a year. She pulled out another document. This is a comparative study on war orphans from the Third Galactic Conflict. Children who maintained consistent caregivers showed 73% better outcomes in emotional regulation, social development, and future relationship stability. I've read this study, Draken said quietly. It's cited in military welfare protocols. Rebecca nodded. Then you know that disrupting their care now, when they're just beginning to feel secure again, could cause lasting damage. The research is clear, Your Majesty. Consistency matters more than species. She set down her papers and met his eyes directly. This was the dangerous part, where she stopped being a scholar and started being honest. But let me set aside the research for a moment and speak from my heart, if you'll permit me. Go ahead. Your children don't need me to teach them how to be dragons. They have excellent tutors for that. The best scholars in the Empire can teach them history, politics, warfare, and leadership. I can't compete with that, and I don't need to. Rebecca's voice grew stronger. What I can teach them, what I have been teaching them, is something just as important. I can teach them that showing kindness isn't weakness. That caring about others doesn't make you soft. That different species can trust each other, work together, love each other. Draken's expression was unreadable, but he was listening intently. You're rebuilding an empire, Draken. She used his name, not his title. In another context, with another dragon, it would get her killed. But she needed him to hear this as truth between equals, not subject to ruler. You're trying to create something better than what existed before the war. I've heard your speeches. You talk about unity, about cooperation between species, about a future where everyone has value regardless of their scales or their lifespan. She leaned forward. But how can you build that future if your own children are taught that humans are lesser? If they learn that kindness to other species is just political strategy rather than genuine respect? They're watching you right now, learning what kind of leader you'll be. What kind of empire you'll create. And they're learning it from how you treat me. The room was silent except for the ticking of an ornate clock on the wall. Rebecca could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Your council thinks I can't teach your children what they need to know because I'm human, she continued. But maybe that's exactly why I'm the right person. Because I can teach them that a person's worth isn't measured in how long they live or how big their wings are. That love isn't about power or prestige. It's about showing up, day after day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. She took a breath, steadying herself for the final push. I will leave if you command it, Your Majesty. I won't fight you in court or cause political problems. But I will never forgive myself if I don't try to change your mind. Those children deserve someone who loves them more than protocol. And you deserve advisors who care more about your family than their own prejudices. Rebecca sat back, her prepared speech finished. She'd said everything she came to say. Now it was in his hands. Draken was quiet for a long moment, his clawed fingers drumming slowly on the arm of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. You called me Draken. Not Your Majesty. Not Emperor. Just my name. I apologize if I overstepped, Rebecca said quickly. I just needed you to hear this as truth, not flattery. Don't apologize. Draken stood, moving to the window. His wings caught the morning light, and Rebecca could see all the scars from battle, the tears that hadn't quite healed right. Do you know what I found when I came home from war? I found my children happy. Actually happy, for the first time since their mother died. And it was because of you. He turned to face her. You're right about everything. The research, the psychology, the message I'd send by removing you. You're right that my children need consistency more than they need another dragon tutor. He smiled slightly. And you're definitely right that I need advisors who care about my family. Does that mean, Rebecca started, hope rising in her chest. It means, Draken interrupted gently, that you're the bravest person I've ever met. And I've met a lot of brave people. He moved back to his desk, his expression determined. Thank you for fighting for my children. Not many people would stand up to an emperor. They're worth fighting for, Rebecca said simply. Yes, Draken agreed. They are. And so are you. The victory celebration was scheduled for the following Saturday. It was meant to be the Empire's grand moment, a massive event broadcast across every dragon world and colony. Millions would watch as Emperor Draken gave his traditional speech about dragon strength, military superiority, and the natural order that placed dragons at the top of the galactic hierarchy. Instead, Draken was about to give them something very different. Rebecca knew something was happening when palace staff brought her a formal gown 3 days before the event. It wasn't servants' clothing. It was the kind of dress worn by nobility, deep emerald green with silver threading that caught the light. A handwritten note from the emperor simply said, "Please attend the celebration as my guest." The morning of the event, the palace was chaos. Decorations went up everywhere, banners showing the imperial crest, flowers imported from a dozen worlds. News crews set up cameras in the grand hall. Dignitaries from across the empire began arriving in shuttles that darkened the sky. Rebecca dressed carefully in her room, hands shaking as she fastened the gown's clasps. Ryan knocked on her door just as she finished. "Miss Rebecca? Dad wants us all to sit together during the speech. You, me, Lily, and Thomas. Right up front where everyone can see." "Are you sure?" Rebecca asked, confused. "That's where the royal family sits." Ryan grinned, showing all his teeth. "I know. Come on, we'll be late." The grand hall was enormous, filled with hundreds of dragons and representatives from allied species. The ceiling stretched up 5 stories, covered in murals showing dragon victories throughout history. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across the assembled crowd. Rebecca had never seen anything so magnificent or terrifying in her life. A palace attendant led them to the front row. The seats were sized for dragons, but smaller chairs had been placed there too. One for Rebecca, and surprisingly, child-sized ones for the 3 young dragons. Usually, heirs stood during formal events. The fact that Draken wanted them seated, comfortable, sent its own message. The crowd noticed immediately. Whispers rippled through the hall. Why was a human sitting with the imperial family? Why were the children being coddled with chairs? What was the emperor thinking? Then Draken entered, and everyone fell silent. He wore his full ceremonial armor, gold and silver plates that caught the light like a second sun. His wings were spread to their full impressive width, nearly 20 feet across. He moved to the podium with the confidence of someone who'd commanded armies and won. "Citizens of the Draconess Empire," he began, his voice amplified to fill every corner of the massive hall. "We gather today to celebrate victory. 3 years of war have ended. The swarm has been defeated. Our territories are secure. Our people are safe." The crowd erupted in cheers. Dragons roared, their combined voices shaking the chandeliers. It went on for nearly a minute before Draken raised a claw for silence. "But today, I don't want to talk about victory in battle. I want to talk about a different kind of victory. A harder kind. Draken's voice softened slightly. When I left for war, I was a father to 3 young children. When I returned, I found them happy and healthy, cared for by someone who had every reason to leave but chose to stay. He gestured toward Rebecca, and suddenly every eye in the hall was on her. She felt her face burn but kept her composure. Rebecca Walsh is human. She has no scales, no wings, no fire breath. By the old measurements of worth, she is lesser than the lowest dragon in this room. Draken paused, letting that statement hang in the air. And yet, she did what many dragons would not. She kept a promise to a dying empress. She raised children that weren't her species. She loved them when loving them was inconvenient and unprofitable. The hall was absolutely silent now. You could have heard a pin drop. I returned from war and found my son had finally spoken again after a year of silence. I found my daughter sleeping peacefully, her nightmares finally fading. I found my eldest standing tall, confident, loved. And it was because one human woman decided that a promise mattered more than her own safety or comfort. Draken descended from the podium and walked toward Rebecca. She stood automatically, unsure what was happening. The 3 children stood too, flanking her protectively. Rebecca Walsh, approach, Draken said formally. She walked forward on shaking legs. The Emperor towered over her, massive and powerful, and for a moment she wondered if she'd completely misread this situation. Then he smiled. I hereby grant you the title of Guardian of the Imperial Heirs and honored member of the Imperial Household. You will be recognized across the Empire as family, with all rights and protections that entails. The crowd murmured in shock. This was unprecedented. A human given noble rank? Declared family to the Emperor himself? But Draken wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am today announcing the creation of the Order of the Faithful. This honor will recognize beings of any species who show extraordinary dedication to the Empire's future. It doesn't matter if you're dragon or human, large or small, powerful or humble. What matters is loyalty, love, and the courage to keep your promises even when the world tells you to break them. He placed a medallion around Rebecca's neck. It was heavy, made of platinum and star rubies, bearing the imperial crest. Rebecca Walsh, you are the first recipient of this honor. May there be many more like you. This time, when the crowd reacted, it was mixed. Some dragons cheered, particularly the younger ones and those who'd fought alongside humans in the war. General Brooks was on his feet applauding. But others looked scandalized. Lady Victoria sat with her wings folded tight, her expression sour. Lord Patterson had actually stood up and walked out. Draken didn't seem to care. He returned to the podium and continued his speech, but the rest of it was different from any victory speech in Imperial history. He talked about cooperation between species. About recognizing value in unexpected places. About building an empire based not on domination but on mutual respect. We won the war because different species fought together, Draken said. Humans held the line when dragons fell. Smaller species provided intelligence when our size made stealth impossible. We won because we worked together, not because dragons are superior. He looked out across the assembled crowd. That's the empire I want to build. One where my children grow up knowing that worth isn't measured in scales or lifespan. Where a human woman can be honored for her dedication. Where anyone, from any world, can matter. The speech ended to thunderous applause from about half the room and stony silence from the other half. It would take time, Rebecca realized. Change always did. But the Emperor had drawn his line in the sand, and she stood on the right side of it. After the ceremony, Ryan hugged her so hard her ribs creaked. Lily cried happy tears that left scorch marks on Rebecca's new dress. And Thomas looked up at her with his golden eyes and said clearly, I love you, Miss Rebecca. Please don't ever leave. Never, she promised. I'm not going anywhere. The years that followed weren't easy. There was resistance from traditionalist dragons. There were political fights and social pressure. But slowly, things changed. More humans and other species were hired in important palace positions. The Imperial Academy started accepting students of all species. Cross-cultural programs became standard. Ryan grew into a wise crown prince who spoke 5 languages and could discuss philosophy with scholars from any species. Lily became a diplomat known for building bridges between worlds that had been enemies for centuries. Thomas, the quiet one, became a poet whose words touched hearts across the galaxy. And Rebecca? She lived to see all of it. 43 more years, watching the children she'd raised become leaders who changed their empire. When she finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at 76 years old, the entire Draconus Empire observed a day of mourning. Draken delivered her eulogy himself, tears streaming down his scaled face without shame or apology. She was just a human, he told billions of watching citizens. Just one small person from one small world. But she proved that the greatest strength isn't in claws or fire or wings. It's in choosing to love when love is difficult. It's in keeping promises when breaking them would be easier. It's in believing that anyone, from anywhere, can change the world. In the Imperial Palace Gardens, they erected a statue. Not marble or bronze, but living crystal that would last 10,000 years. It showed Rebecca in that oversized chair, 3 dragon children asleep in her arms, all of them peaceful and safe. The plaque at the base was simple, she stayed. And the Empire, forever changed by one human woman's courage, remembered.